Judge Elizabeth Hamilton sat behind her mahogany desk in the busy municipal courthouse on a cold Wednesday morning. The large room was filled with the sound of shuffling papers and quiet conversations. People sat on wooden benches, waiting nervously for their names to be called. Some looked at their phones, others stared at the floor, and a few whispered to family members beside them. Elizabeth had been a judge for 15 years. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a perfect bun, and her black robes were pressed, without a single wrinkle. She wore small gold glasses that made her look serious and important. The lawyers and court workers all knew her reputation. She followed every rule exactly and never accepted excuses from anyone who broke the law. The morning had started like any other. Elizabeth had already heard cases about speeding tickets, parking violations, and small disputes between neighbors. She moved through each case quickly and efficiently. Her voice was always calm but firm, and she rarely smiled or showed emotion. The courtroom clerk, a thin man named Mr. Peters, called out in a loud voice, "Case number 42847, Rebecca Thompson versus the city." A well-dressed black woman in her 30s stood up from the back row. She wore a navy blue suit with a white blouse and carried a small black purse. Her hair was styled neatly, and she walked forward with quiet confidence. Despite the formal setting, there was something warm and approachable about her manner. Rebecca Thompson approached the defendant's table and stood with her hands folded in front of her. She looked directly at Judge Hamilton with respect, but without fear. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast a gentle glow across the courtroom. "Miss Thompson," Judge Hamilton said without looking up from the papers scattered across her desk. She was reviewing the details of the case while speaking. "You're here for parking in a restricted zone outside City Hall on Monday afternoon. The fine is listed as $300. How do you plead?" Rebecca cleared her throat gently and spoke in a soft but clear voice. "Your Honor, I plead guilty to the parking violation. But I would like to explain the circumstances, if I may." Judge Hamilton finally lifted her eyes from the papers. Her expression was stern and showed no interest in hearing explanations. She had heard thousands of excuses over the years, and they all sounded the same to her. People always had reasons for breaking the law, but reasons didn't change the facts, Miss Thompson. She said with a slight sigh, "I've heard every excuse. In the book during my 15 years on this bench, you parked illegally in a restricted zone. That's all that matters here. The law is clear about parking violations." Rebecca's voice remained calm and respectful, even though she could sense the judge's impatience. "Your Honor, I completely understand. But I was helping an elderly gentleman named Mr. Davies who had fallen on the sidewalk outside City Hall. He was hurt and bleeding from his knee. I couldn't just walk past him." "Miss Thompson," Judge Hamilton interrupted, raising her hand to stop Rebecca from continuing. Her tone was sharp and final. "I don't have time for stories about helping people. You broke the law by parking in a restricted zone. That's a fact. Your reasons don't change what you did." Rebecca tried once more, speaking quickly before she could be interrupted again. "Your Honor, the elderly man needed assistance getting to the medical center. I was only trying to help someone who was injured and alone." Judge Hamilton's patience had run out completely. She looked at Rebecca with cold eyes and spoke in a voice that filled the entire courtroom. "Miss Thompson, I'm increasing your fine to $500 plus court costs for wasting the court's time with unnecessary explanations. You will pay the full amount within 30 days. Next case." Rebecca stood there for a moment, her eyes showing quiet disappointment and hurt. She had hoped that someone in a position of authority would listen to her story and understand that she had been trying to help another human being. But she could see that Judge Hamilton had already dismissed her completely. With great dignity, Rebecca simply nodded her head and said, "Thank you, Your Honor." She turned and walked slowly toward the exit, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She didn't argue or complain. Even though the harsh treatment had clearly affected her, Judge Hamilton had already moved on to organizing the papers for the next case. She didn't watch Rebecca leave. And she didn't give Rebecca Thompson another thought. To her, it was just another routine morning in her courtroom. Another parking violation, another person who had broken the law and tried to make excuses. The clerk called the next case number, and the busy courthouse continued with its daily business. Nobody in the room knew that something important had just happened, something that would change everything in the days to come. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Judge Elizabeth Hamilton's private chambers. As she sat at her wooden desk reviewing case files, the room was quiet except for the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall and the distant sounds of the courthouse hallway. Stacks of legal documents covered her desk, and she worked methodically through each one, making notes with her expensive fountain pen. Elizabeth had always found comfort in the orderly routine of her work after court sessions ended. She would retreat to her chambers to prepare for the next day's cases. The room reflected her personality perfectly with its neat bookshelves, organized filing cabinets, and the small collection of legal awards displayed on the wall. A gentle knock interrupted her concentration. Emma, her young clerk, stood in the doorway holding the afternoon newspaper. Emma was a recent law school graduate who had been working for Judge Hamilton for 6 months. She was always eager to help and had a bright, cheerful personality that sometimes contrasted with the serious atmosphere of the courthouse. "Judge Hamilton, I brought today's newspaper," Emma said, stepping into the room. "I thought you might want to see the front page. There's an interesting story about our new mayor." Emma placed the folded newspaper on the desk next to Elizabeth's case files. The paper was still crisp and fresh, with the ink smell that came from the morning printing. Elizabeth glanced at it briefly, but continued writing her notes. "Thank you, Emma. I'll look at it later," Elizabeth said without much interest. She was focused on a complicated case involving a property dispute and didn't want to be distracted by local politics. But Emma remained standing by the desk, looking excited about something. "Judge Hamilton, I really think you should see this. Now, the story is quite remarkable." Elizabeth looked up from her work and noticed Emma's enthusiasm. With a small sigh, she set down her pen and picked up the newspaper. As she unfolded it, her eyes immediately went to the large headline at the top of the page. The words hit her like a physical blow. "Rebecca Thompson makes history, city's first black female mayor." Below the headline was a large, professional photograph of a woman in a navy blue suit, smiling warmly at the camera. It was unmistakably the same woman who had stood before her bench that morning. Elizabeth's hands began to tremble slightly as she stared at the photograph. The confident, dignified woman in the picture was the same person she had dismissed so harshly just hours earlier. The same person she had refused to listen to when she tried to explain about helping an injured elderly man. "This can't be right," Elizabeth whispered to herself. But she knew it was true. The face in the photograph was burned into her memory from their encounter in the courtroom. She began reading the article with growing amazement and horror. The story described Rebecca's incredible journey from humble beginnings to becoming the city's first black female mayor. It told of her childhood in a poor neighborhood, raised by a single grandmother who worked as a cleaning lady. The article explained how Rebecca had become a single mother at 19 when her boyfriend left her. Instead of giving up on her dreams, she had worked 2 jobs to support a young son while attending community college classes at night. She worked at a grocery store during the day, stocking shelves and helping customers. then cleaned office buildings late at night when her son was sleeping. Elizabeth read about how Rebecca had saved every penny she could to eventually transfer to a four-year university. She studied law while continuing to work and raise her son alone. The article described the many nights Rebecca fell asleep over her law books. Exhausted from working and studying, she graduated with honors from law school despite facing incredible challenges. The article continued. Rebecca Thompson never forgot where she came from or the people who helped her along the way. The story went on to describe Rebecca's years as a community organizer after law school. Instead of taking a high-paying job at a law firm, she had chosen to work with families in poverty, helping them fight for affordable housing and better schools. She had organized food drives, created job training programs, and spent countless hours listening to people's problems. The article mentioned Rebecca's recent election campaign, which had focused on helping the most vulnerable citizens in the city. It described her daily routine of walking through different neighborhoods, knocking on doors, and sitting on front porches to hear people's concerns. She had promised to be a mayor who would always put others first. Emma watched as Judge Hamilton's face grew pale. The confident, stern expression she usually wore had been replaced by something that looked like shock and regret. "Judge, is everything all right?" Emma asked with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Elizabeth looked up from the newspaper, her voice barely above a whisper. I made a terrible mistake this morning." That evening, Judge Elizabeth Hamilton sat in her large living room, surrounded by expensive furniture and beautiful artwork. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of her grandfather clock. She had lived in this house for 20 years, and it had always been her peaceful retreat after long days at the courthouse. But tonight, she felt anything but peaceful. Elizabeth couldn't concentrate on anything. She tried to read a book, but the words blurred together. She turned on the television, but the programs seemed meaningless. Every few minutes, she found herself thinking about Rebecca Thompson and what had happened in her courtroom that morning. The comfortable leather chair where she usually relaxed felt uncomfortable now. She kept shifting and changing positions, unable to find peace. The warm light from her table lamps, which usually made her feel cozy, now seemed to highlight the emptiness she felt inside. Finally, Elizabeth stood up and walked to her study. This room had always been her favorite place in the house. The walls were lined with law books, and her desk was covered with legal journals and case studies. On one shelf, she kept photo albums from her college and law school days. She pulled out a thick album with a brown leather cover and sat down at her desk. As she opened it, memories flooded back. The first page showed pictures of her graduation from law school. She was smiling brightly, wearing her cap and gown, surrounded by her proud family. Elizabeth looked at the pictures of her parents, both successful lawyers who had paid for her education without her ever worrying about money. Her father had been a partner at a prestigious law firm, and her mother had been a judge before her. They had introduced her to important people and opened doors that might have stayed closed for others. She turned the pages slowly, looking at pictures of her comfortable childhood home, family vacations to Europe, and expensive cars. Everything had been provided for her. She had never worked in a grocery store or cleaned office buildings late at night. She had never worried about paying rent or buying food for her children. Elizabeth remembered her law school years. While other students worked part-time jobs and stressed about student loans, she had been able to focus entirely on her studies. She had joined the best study groups, attended exclusive social events, and made connections with influential professors. "I never had to struggle for anything," she whispered to herself as she looked at the photos. She closed the album and walked to her computer for the next 3 hours. Elizabeth searched online for every article she could find about Rebecca Thompson. She read about Rebecca's volunteer work at homeless shelters, where she served meals every weekend and helped people find jobs and housing. She found articles about the job training programs Rebecca had created for people who had been in prison and couldn't find work. The programs had helped hundreds of people get back on their feet and become productive members of society. Elizabeth read about Rebecca's fight for better schools in poor neighborhoods. She had organized parent meetings, spoken at city council meetings, and even used her own money to buy school supplies for children whose families couldn't afford them. There were pictures of Rebecca at community events, always smiling and listening to people's concerns. She was shown helping elderly people fill out government forms, reading to children at the library, and painting houses for families who couldn't afford to hire painters. "She's dedicated her entire life to helping others," Elizabeth said aloud, her voice filled with amazement and shame. Elizabeth thought about her own life. She had focused on following rules and procedures, but had she really helped anyone? She had been proud of her reputation for being strict and fair, but now she wondered if she had been fair at all. She remembered the hundreds of people who had stood before her bench over the years. How many had tried to explain their circumstances, only to be cut off like Rebecca had been? How many had genuine reasons for their actions that she had never bothered to hear? Elizabeth recalled a young mother who had been caught shoplifting baby food. The woman had tried to explain that she had lost her job, and her baby was hungry. But Elizabeth had focused only on the fact that stealing was wrong. She had never asked if the woman needed help finding resources for food assistance. She thought about an elderly man who had been driving without a valid license. He had tried to explain that he couldn't afford to renew it and needed to drive to his medical appointments. But Elizabeth had only seen a person who had broken the law. "What kind of judge am I if I don't listen to people's stories?" Elizabeth whispered to herself, her voice breaking with emotion. The weight of her mistake with Rebecca pressed down on her heart like a heavy stone. She had treated a woman of incredible character and service as if she were just another rule breaker trying to avoid consequences. Elizabeth realized that her prejudices and assumptions had clouded her judgment, and she felt deeply ashamed. That night, Elizabeth barely slept. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, knowing she had to make things right somehow. The next morning, Judge Elizabeth Hamilton woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest. She had barely slept, and her mind kept replaying the events from the previous day. As she got dressed for work, she made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of driving to the courthouse, she would go to City Hall. Elizabeth had never visited City Hall before, even though it was only a few blocks away from the courthouse. As she drove through the morning traffic, her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had practiced what she wanted to say, but now the words seemed to disappear from her mind. The City Hall building was older than the courthouse, with tall stone columns and wide steps leading to the entrance. Elizabeth parked her car and sat. For a moment, trying to gather her courage. She had always been confident in courtrooms and legal settings, but this felt completely different. This was personal. She walked up the steps and through the heavy glass doors. The lobby was busy with people coming and going, some carrying papers, others talking on phones. Elizabeth approached the reception desk where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes was answering phone calls. "Excuse me," Elizabeth said when the receptionist finished her call. "I'm Judge Hamilton from the municipal courthouse. I was wondering if I could speak with Mayor Thompson." The receptionist looked at her with surprise. "Judge Hamilton, do you have an appointment scheduled?" Elizabeth felt her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment. "No, I don't have an appointment. I know this is unusual, but it's very important." I really need to speak with her. The receptionist studied Elizabeth's face and seemed to sense the urgency in her voice. Let me call her office and see if she's available. Please have a seat. Elizabeth sat on one of the wooden benches in the lobby, watching people walk by. She noticed how different this place felt from the courthouse. People here seemed more relaxed, more hopeful. Children played quietly while their parents filled out forms, and elderly residents sat chatting with city workers who seemed genuinely interested in helping them. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, Elizabeth heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Rebecca Thompson walking toward her. Rebecca was wearing a simple grey dress and comfortable shoes, despite everything that had happened in court the day before. She was smiling warmly. "Judge Hamilton," Rebecca said, extending her hand. "What a surprise to see you here. Please, come to my office." Elizabeth stood up, feeling nervous and grateful at the same time. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I know you must be very busy." "Not too busy for this," Rebecca replied, leading the way down a long hallway as they walked. Elizabeth noticed the photographs covering the walls. There were pictures of Rebecca at community events, standing with families at ribbon cutting, ceremonies, reading to children at the library, and helping elderly residents at senior centers. Every picture showed Rebecca listening to people, smiling and clearly caring about the individuals she was with. Rebecca's office was smaller than Elizabeth had expected. It wasn't fancy or impressive like the judge's chambers. The desk was simple, wood, and the chairs were comfortable but not expensive. What struck Elizabeth most were the thank you cards covering one entire wall. There were hundreds of them, written in different handwriting styles, some clearly from children. "Please, sit down," Rebecca said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "How can I help you?" Elizabeth sat down and took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she folded them in her lap to try to keep them still. She had never felt so nervous or uncertain in her entire career. "Mayor Thompson," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "I came here to apologize. Yesterday in my courtroom, I failed you completely. I failed to listen to you. I failed to show you the respect you deserved as a person and as a leader in our community." Rebecca's expression softened, and she leaned forward slightly. "Judge Hamilton, I appreciate you coming here to say that," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger but still shaking with emotion. "After you left my courtroom yesterday, I learned about your work, your background, everything you've done for this community. I spent hours reading about your life and your service to others." She paused, looking directly at Rebecca. "I realized that when you were trying to explain about helping Mr. Davies, you were doing exactly what a good leader should do. You were putting others first, even when it meant getting a parking ticket." Rebecca nodded slowly, her eyes showing understanding rather than anger. "Mr. Davies is 83 years old. Judge Hamilton, he had fallen and twisted his ankle badly. He was bleeding and scared, and there was no one else round to help him. I couldn't just walk past him." "Of course you couldn't," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with regret. "And I should have listened to you. I should have seen that you were showing compassion and doing what was right. Not making excuses." Rebecca smiled gently, and Elizabeth could see why the community had chosen her as their leader. "We all make mistakes, Judge Hamilton. What matters most is what we do next." 3 months had passed since the difficult morning in Judge Elizabeth Hamilton's courtroom. The old community center on Maple Street was filled with more people than it had seen in years. Colorful balloons hung from the ceiling, and folding chairs were arranged in neat rows. The smell of fresh coffee and homemade cookies filled the air as neighbors. City workers and local business owners gathered for a special announcement. Judge Elizabeth Hamilton stood at the front of the room next to Mayor Rebecca Thompson. The two women looked comfortable together, Like old friends who had known each other for years, Elizabeth wore a simple blue dress instead of her usual black robes. And Rebecca had chosen a cheerful yellow blouse that made her smile seem even. Brighter. The crowd quieted down as Rebecca stepped forward to speak. She looked round the room at the familiar faces of people she had worked with and helped over the years. There were elderly residents from the senior center, young mothers, with their children, and workers from various city departments. Ladies and gentlemen, Rebecca began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Today, we are launching something very special. It's called the Community Justice Program, and it's going to change how a city handles minor legal violations. She paused and smiled at Elizabeth before continuing. Instead of just paying fines and walking away, people who commit minor violations will have the chance to perform community service and get help with any underlying problems they might be facing. Elizabeth stepped forward, feeling more nervous than she had in years. Speaking to crowds in her courtroom was easy, but this was different. These were her neighbors, and she was about to admit that she had been wrong about many things. This program exists because Mayor Thompson taught me something very important, Elizabeth said. Her voice steady but filled with emotion. She showed me that true justice isn't just about following rules and handing out punishments. It's about understanding people's stories and helping them become better citizens and stronger community members. An elderly man in the front row nodded approvingly. He was Mr. Davies, the same man Rebecca had helped on the day she got her parking ticket. His ankle had healed completely, and he had become one of Rebecca's strongest supporters. Rebecca took over again, explaining how the program had already begun helping people. We've been testing this program for the past month, and the results have been amazing. Let me tell you about some of the people we've helped. She pointed to a woman sitting in the third row. Mrs. Miller received a citation for letting her yard become overgrown. Instead of just paying a fine, she was connected with volunteers who helped her clean up her property. More importantly, we learned that she was struggling with depression after her husband's death. Now she's receiving counseling and has made new friends who check on her regularly. Mrs. Miller smiled and waved at the crowd. She looked healthier and happier than she had in months. And there's Tom Wilson, Rebecca continued, gesturing to a young man near the back. He was caught shoplifting food from a grocery store. Instead of just paying a fine and possibly going to jail, he was connected with our job training program. Tom now has a steady job at the hardware store and is saving money to go to college. Tom stood up briefly and nodded to the crowd. His face showed pride and determination that hadn't been there before. Elizabeth spoke again, her voice growing stronger with each word. Judge Hamilton now takes time to listen to each person who comes before her bench, and our city provides support to help people solve their problems instead of just punishing them. She looked directly at Rebecca with deep gratitude. Mayor Thompson showed me that everyone has a story worth hearing. She taught me that true justice requires not just law and order, but also compassion and understanding. The crowd began to applaud, and Elizabeth felt a warmth in her chest that she had never experienced before. For the first time in her career, she felt like she was truly making a difference in people's lives. Rebecca and Elizabeth had become close friends over the past 3 months. They met for coffee every week to discuss cases and plan improvements to the program. Their partnership had begun to heal divisions in the community that had existed for years. People who had once felt ignored by the legal system now felt heard and supported. As the celebration continued with refreshments and conversation, Elizabeth walked round the room talking to community members. She listened to their stories and learned about their lives in ways she never had before. Rebecca approached her with a warm smile. Thank you for having the courage to apologize and change. It couldn't have been easy. Elizabeth smiled back, feeling more peaceful than she had in years. Thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like. You've changed my life completely. Their friendship had become a symbol of hope for the entire community, proving that when people come together with open hearts and honest intentions, they can create positive change that benefits everyone.